This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. Healthcare professionals can lead their careers with LinkedIn. Discover jobs by specialty, preferred shifts, and even desired salary. From mental health therapists to radiology technicians, it's now faster and easier for healthcare professionals to find the right fit. Learn more at linkedin.com/healthcare. Side effects may include faster job placement, improved work-life balance, and increased career satisfaction.
Welcome to Farm Here Daily, a field-forward podcast. I'm David Geiger, your host. I've been on Iowa TV and radio for the last decade, and I am excited to join you on this podcast, Farm Here Daily. Today on the program, a conversation on plant pathology and science communication with Ed Zaworski, host of the podcast I See Dead Plants. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community, keeping folks informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Here Daily. All right, joining us on Farm Here Daily, we have Ed Zaworski. He is a plant pathologist with Iowa State University Extension, and he's also the host of the I See Dead Plants podcast. And I wanted to talk to Ed because I'm a big fan of talking about science and getting into the weeds, and that may be an unintentional pun there. But Ed, thank you so much for joining me, and tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, thanks for having me, David. Man, telling you about myself. Well, I am a extension plant pathologist here at Iowa State University. I did my master's degree looking at soybean cyst nematode and soybean sudden death syndrome. And I worked in the plant and insect diagnostic clinic for about 10 or 11 years before I really transitioned into doing a lot more extension teaching, extension outreach, and then hosting this podcast. So I've done a lot of things. I never thought I was going to be hosting a podcast and talking to people for a living, but here I am.
Well, I was giving your podcast a listen, and it seems to really delve deep into some of these scientific conversations that's going on within the agronomic community. Can you tell me a little bit about your podcast as well?
Yeah, so the I See Dead Plants podcast was kind of the original idea was that we were going to just do kind of monologues about historical instances of plant pathology and entomology and try to reach the general public, try to get people an idea of what is this stuff? What is plant pathology? What is entomology? Why is it important? You know, we were going to talk about stuff like the Irish potato famine or, you know, big things in the news today like coffee rust and banana wilt and some of these things. And I think, you know, in trying to develop this, we recorded a few things, and then we started to think about, well, how are we going to market this and how are we going to get this out? And we were having difficulties, and we produced some podcasts, we did some interview style stuff, and we kind of just through word of mouth kind of figured out that most of our audience was going to be, you know, extension folks or ag business folks or academia. So we started to kind of gear it more towards that and more towards this interview style, in part because doing the research for a historical podcast took a lot of time. I did one early on, and it was on coffee rust, and it took me a long time to do all the research to kind of, I'm not going to say become an expert in coffee rust because didn't even come close to that, but I, you know, just knowledgeable enough to talk about the subject. So we kind of shifted towards this interview style where I am still talking to mostly professors on what they're researching on a particular pathogen, shed some light on a pathogen or an insect pest, and what's the current research and what's the research going forward, the prognosis, so to speak. So
I feel a kindred spirit here because I've been in farm broadcasting for 12 years, and that's taught me a lot of the questions to ask, but I'm not necessarily personally super knowledgeable about the in-depth analysis or studies of a lot of the things. And so that brings to mind my first question, which is, as a fellow communicator, what is the state of communication within the scientific community, specifically with agriculture and farm systems?
The state of communication. Well, I'll take a stab at this, and you can tell me if I'm answering your question the way that you think. But I mean, I think that the state of communication is a wide open doorway right now. I think that what we've learned with this podcast and a lot of other stuff that, I work with the Crop Protection Network a lot,
Right.
if you're familiar. I think what we're learning as we go is that there are so many ways to communicate, and we're trying to figure out how to harness as many of them as we can, especially, with younger generations coming into, not just farming, but everything. But we're trying to figure out how to harness these different styles of communication and how to further reach more people or the same people with more content and educate them as much as we can on the subjects that we have. And, even something, I guess what I've learned in doing this podcast is that I think even something as niche as plant pathology, plant pests, plant insect pests, anybody can have an audience with any kind of communication type. And you just have to learn the process as being a communicator for so long. And
I appreciate you saying that, because part of the reason why I was really interested in talking about this is science is not easy to talk about. It's not easy to get into and discuss because of the terminology and the knowledge required for a lot of the background information. And I think of the first thing that was the huge hurdle for me, and that was just learning acronyms. There are so many acronyms in agriculture. You have USDA, you have FSA, you have all sorts of integral parts that if you just set all of those things out, it would take forever. And so communication revolves around being precise or making more efficient our words. So how do you balance that when you're trying to educate people and communicate with others, with people who are incredibly knowledgeable about their subject?
Yeah, well, David, I'll say I do my best. I strive in every podcast to do exactly that, to kind of keep things in check, ask people what they mean about an acronym, ask people what they mean about a scientific term that, might not be common knowledge to everybody. I fully admit, I don't always do a great job of this. I think anybody in their respective field can get lulled into this.
The jargon.
Well, you understand as you're talking to somebody, you understand
Right.
all the jargon and the acronyms that, well, maybe, I definitely don't understand. That's probably my, one of my strengths in hosting this podcast, especially when I'm talking to an entomologist, someone who studies insects. I really don't know a lot about it. So I have to ask them a lot of the questions, the clarification questions naturally. And I find, even as a plant pathologist, if I get outside of the world of corn and soybeans, I really don't know a lot. So I do have to ask a lot of clarification questions. But that's kind of what I try to rest on when I'm hosting this podcast. I try to make sure that I try to do my best, I should say.
Right.
That I'm asking the clarification questions that, the last question I always ask at the end of my podcast is I ask the interviewee to kind of sum up in a few sentences or a short paragraph or just a little short blurb. Like, why is this important? Explain it as if you're explaining it to my mom. And she lives in a condo right off of Lake Michigan in Chicago. I wasn't part of agriculture growing up. She definitely wasn't. So, I try to really get people to, hey, why is this important to anybody who might be listening? And I try to keep that in mind as I'm recording the podcast. I try to do my best to, anyway.
A fun little aside on that one, as a journalist, and I speaking to tons and tons of people, I've been asked a couple times just advice on interviews and talking to people. And I told them, listen, if you're ever talking to a journalist, especially those types of journalists that only have a little bit of time and they're looking for a 15-second soundbite or a 20-second soundbite or maybe even just a 10-second soundbite, if you're talking to them, give them the background information because you want them to understand the context. And that's why people will talk and give lots of information, because they want the context to be understood. But when you're done giving the context, take a moment at the very end and sum it up in 10 to 15 seconds. And so that's just a little piece of advice I give folks, especially within the science community, because I guarantee you, if you give someone an easy 10 to 15 second soundbite at the end summing stuff up, that is the quote they're going to be using. And that means you get to help control the narrative and the expression of science that you're trying to make yourself.
Yeah. It's really hard to do. I tend to give, every podcast that I do, I give people, a little short outline and with questions on it. And in part, it's for me to make sure that I've boned up on the subject enough to ask good questions, but it's also to give them a heads up is here's some questions for you to think about. And that one at the end, I especially like to give them time, because if you were to just offhand slap somebody with that question, I think you might not get as good of an answer as if somebody has had time to think about it. But
sometimes it's just too much. There's too much to say to really just put it into just a little bit of time.
Right. But that's why I love podcasts also, is I look at this podcast as the interviewee gets the opportunity to have the full discussion, as well as sum it up like that at the end for someone who wants that final summation. So,
Ed, let's talk about the Crop Protection Network, because that's a part of what you do as well. What is that, and what are you guys doing?
So I'll do my best to sum up in my own words what the Crop Protection Network is. But, you can go on the website and look up the mission statement for the full version. But from my standpoint, the Crop Protection Network is a multi-state, multi-professor conglomerate of people that are trying to give people the best advice with regards to managing pests, right? So before the Crop Protection Network, I think every university had their own kind of extension service, and each extension pathologist in their respective state or entomologist was kind of making their own version of kind of a similar article that each state was writing. So the Crop Protection Network their aim is to, collaborate from state to state across the U.S. and give people the best information that they can for their region for managing pests.
This is Farm Here Daily. We will continue our conversation with Ed in just a moment, but first, let's take a look at the marketplace. And it looks like there was a negative close for Thursday in the grain trade. July corn down 3/4 penny at 409.5. September falling a penny at 404. Soybeans in July 2.5 cents down at 10.22 3/4, with August a penny and 3/4 weaker at 10.27 3/4. Soybean meal in July $5.10 a ton in the red at $270.90. July wheat 7.25 cents down 5.21, with September 7 3/4 weaker at 5.36 3/4. In the livestock market close for Thursday, June live cattle up 10 cents a hundredweight at $221.70. August up 22 cents at $209.20. Feeder cattle in August $1 a hundredweight more at $303.30, with September rising 77 cents at $303.37. Lean hogs in July down $0.50 at $112.32, with August falling 97 cents at $110.25 a hundredweight. That is the Thursday market close. This is Farm Here Daily.
Running a business comes with a lot of what-ifs. But luckily, there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what-ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
We're speaking with Ed Zaworski. He is the host of the I See Dead Plants podcast. Also, he is an extension specialist working with ISU Extension. Ed, I wanted to move a little bit more into depth of your podcast and your focus there. Can you talk a little bit about some of the important issues that have agronomic challenges, especially when it comes to the day-to-day business of what farmers have to deal with?
I could go on any number of tangents here. If I'm to stick within the realm of plant pathology and entomology, I'll just say this. Rather than point to specific agronomic challenges, my podcast, we address a couple of things. We address, plant pathogens, and we address insect problems. And those things, they vary from year to year, depending on the weather, depending on the crops that are out there, depending on new technologies that may have arisen, and it's kind of an arm race. It's a forever arms race between us and the pests and pathogens trying to damage our crops. But one common theme that always comes up in the podcast is that despite the fact that anyone in their respective field kind of likes to sit in their ivory tower, I like to say, we all like to think that our facet of agronomics is the most important thing. Farmers, growers, they have to deal with so many things on a day-to-day basis that I think it's really hard to frame up problems that those folks face when growing crops anywhere in the United States, so I guess at the end of that, I'll say, my podcast, I like to shed light on some of these pest problems and insect problems. Some of them are real-time issues, and some of them are issues of the past that we can learn from. And there's a lot of challenges, and there's a lot of people working on these challenges to help growers make the best crops that they can.
I think immediately of three primary issues, and I'm sure there's plenty more, and some of them may encompass a lot of things within it. For example, technology can involve genetics research, as well as latest chemical compositions or actual technology hardware that exists. So there's technology, there's resistances to those technologies, and then I would say also invasive species would be another huge aspect. Would you add any other huge topics that you really think are important? And I say that, but then I immediately think of communication issues and public opinion politics, even getting involved with how we deal with the science.
You kind of hit the nail on the head as far as from my standpoint as someone who works with pathogens and pests. The big issues are the things that we talk about the most are definitely invasives, chemical resistance issues, the breaking down of host resistance, or the plant's natural or derived resistance that we've bred into them. So beyond that, you mentioned resistances. Just to elaborate on that a little bit, you've definitely got fungicide, herbicide, insecticide resistances happening, but on top of that, you have pathogens either changing genetically to overcome these things, as well as something that I've been kind of keyed into recently. I just did a recent podcast talking about fungal taxonomy with somebody. We're learning so much about pathogens and pests with new technologies in labs also, that's kind of both muddying the water and helping us understand these things a little bit better and kind of develop new methods of management, as well as kind of learning about the ways that these methods of management could be kind of broken down, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Because another impact within this, and this is kind of why I was asking some of those questions for some of the background information, is as you tackle these issues, as you look at solutions, we have this knowledge that farmers have a limited set of tools in their toolbox. And the constant message I get from farm groups and folks is that we're losing those tools. We're not putting more tools in the toolbox. We are removing tools from the toolbox, and that makes it harder to deal with pests and plant health issues. What do you think is kind of an aspect of that, or what is something that you like to talk to with the scientists that you engage with?
I'm glad you brought that up, because I work as part of a team here at Iowa State University called the Integrated Pest Management Team. So our goal, our mission is to kind of shed light on, educate people on the different ways they can manage pests. And you mentioned, you can see it, you can really see it in the field of kind of weed science, which I don't really touch much on in the podcast because we have a sister podcast called War Against Weeds that does a lot of discussions about weeds. But I mean, you can physically see resistance to herbicides happening out in farm fields. Whereas in the pathogen in the insect world, these things are much smaller. It's not something that you're not seeing a giant beetle out on the landscape walking around. But yeah, integrated pest management is kind of the idea that we would like people to use in symphony different types of pest management. So crop rotation, host resistance, as well as chemical intervention to kind of prolong the longevity of each of these types of management, right? So, I mean, just to give you an example, I mean, I think anybody who listens to your podcast has probably heard of fungicide resistance.
Yes.
Or herbicide resistance, right? And
absolutely.
If we use these chemicals year after year in the presence or absence of a pathogen, we are putting selective pressure on pathogens, and they are changing over time genetically to be tolerant of, let's just keep it in fungicides for now. But if you were to, adapt and use an integrated pest management style, you use less fungicides, let's say, and you use crop rotation, and you try to, when possible, use host resistance. You can, the idea is you can probably prolong the use of those chemicals. And I like to tell people, that we're not coming up with new chemical formulations or active ingredients, left, right, and center at this point. So prolonging those things to use in kind of worst case scenarios at this point is a thing to start thinking about. So
there's a question I'd like to ask that I'd like to just think about, because I want to make another point with this, but I do want to ask later on how some of those resistances play out in the long term. If you do stop using certain chemicals, will things lose resistance to it? But before that, I want to bring up actually just a conversation I had a couple days ago with ISU Extension Aaron Hodson about soybean gallmage. We were talking about how that was a pressure that was put on some of the plants, potentially because they might have lost their original food source and then moved to another legume, which is soybeans. And so that is just an alternative sort of pressure that was put onto that insect to migrate, potentially. That's kind of a hypothesis at the moment. And so that's just a pretty huge aspect of the ever-changing nature of biology and its impact on agriculture. So I guess the question would be then, how do you then look at that biology and then deal with some of the resistance issues or some of the ever-changing nature of how the science is engaged with?
So I guess the way I'll answer that is, and the way that I kind of wrap up a lot of my podcasts is, as pathologists, as entomologists, as growers, as crop scouts, as ag business people, it's really important to stay vigilant. There's a lot of pathogens. I mean, you mentioned invasive species. Invasive species are one aspect of things that could happen. We've seen it here in Iowa. We've seen the emerald ash borer roll through and decimate ash trees and remove a bunch of ash trees, and that's a very forward-facing example of an invasive species that caused a lot of damage. But we also have things that occur that with pathogens that have been around for, first identified 50, 60, 70 years ago, that all of a sudden become a problem because of changing conditions. I mean, you mentioned soybean gallmage. When the stars align, sometimes things become a problem. And what I like to emphasize in the podcast is just my gratitude for the people doing research who are kind of staying vigilant and keeping an eye on these things. So, like I said, growers have a lot of things to keep an eye on, to manage. If they had to keep an eye on all this stuff by themselves, it would be a lot harder. I kind of rest peacefully knowing that there are researchers across the country that are keeping an eye on these things and trying to stay a step ahead.
So let's return to that question I asked a little earlier. When you deal with some of the resistance, as just a general question, is that something where you can stop, you like find some other tools, use those for a while, and then return to an older tool and have those work again? Or once resistance is built in, does it just stick around?
Yeah. So that's a complicated question. I'm definitely not an expert, but I'll take a stab here for you. I mean, first of all, with fungicides, herbicides, insecticides, a good idea is to either mix modes of action or rotate or change modes of action over time. Exposing a pest of any kind to the same, chemical mode of action over and over again is going to be what is adding the selective pressure over time. And, doing that same thing over and over again is the worst case scenario. But if you're able to change the mode of action, from year to year or every 2 years, every 3 years, whatever you're able to do, that's certainly going to help reduce the risk of resistance occurring. And I mean, you asked does it go away after a long time, essentially, or if you stopped using a particular pesticide, would the resistance go away? And the answer, as far as I'll tell you, is it depends. I mean, the genetics of how resistance is developed kind of varies from pathogen to pathogen. Sometimes resistance to a pesticide carries what we would call a fitness penalty genetically, meaning, it costs that pathogen or that insect something in their genetics to have that resistance. That's, in absence of the pesticide, it would be a drag on that individual, right? And not everything has a fitness penalty. Some mutations that would, allow resistance to occur don't have that fitness penalty, so they don't go away over time. So it's the classic "it depends," which I know everybody hates, but yeah, it does depend.
I think science is nuanced, and important things tend to be nuanced as well. And so it depends is honestly a preferred answer than someone claiming that they know the silver bullet. So I do not mind that answer personally. I would like to wrap up the conversation with a final question on the importance of science and the importance of this type of research that you engage with, that you do, that you talk to other people who do. And I understand that both of us may be a little bit biased because it's clear through our conversation that we really like looking into the research. We like hearing what has to be said. But I just want to hear your perspective on why this type of science is important. And then I would also like your feelings on how folks can continue to support science.
Man, that's a really good question, David. Well, I'll start with how I think people can continue to support science. That's a really tough question in and of itself, but I think that the way that I would want, a member of the general public, let's say, to support science is to just do a little bit of research yourself, do a little bit of reading yourself, kind of figure out what are trusted sources to read, right? Like I fully don't expect people to go out and pick up a scientific publication, like your average person. Like that's part of why I do this podcast, is because I have experience reading scientific publications. I can read them. I can pick out the important points, and I can talk to people about them on that podcast. But I would encourage people to just this goes for any aspect of life, right? Like to find trusted sources and read up on them when you can. I know we don't all have time to do that for everything, but make an effort to do so. And then, can you remind me about the first part of the question?
Why do you personally find science to be important?
Well, that's much easier to answer, I should say. So I'll hit home again on the idea that there's a famous quote, and I'm going to paraphrase it here, is that for pests and pathogens, their greatest ally in us is our short-term memory. I think that the value of science and research is, there's not always going to be some groundbreaking results in every bit of research that's being done. But I think it's very important to keep doing research so that we can keep expanding our knowledge on, we'll stick to pests and pathogens for this. We can keep expanding our knowledge on pests and pathogens so that, when something does come down the road that's a big issue, we're ready for it, basically.
Ed Zaworski, the host of the I See Dead Plants podcast. If folks are interested in listening to the conversations you have with scientists, what are some of the best ways they can find your podcast?
So you can find I See Dead Plants anywhere that podcasts are found, but the majority of people probably access it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or straight from our Libsyn webpage.
Thank you so much for joining us on Farm Here Daily.
Thank you, David. It was great.
Thanks, Ed. This is Farm Here Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Again, in order to continue to produce this type of local content, we would love to have you join our community. So please follow the podcast, share it with your friends, and take a look at our social media channels at Field Forward Pod. Additionally, you can find me on social media at Geiger Reports, as well as WHO TV Channel 13 every weekday in their morning and noon hour programs. Again, I am your host, David Geiger, and I'll be back again tomorrow, everybody.